Good afternoon, everybody. Kim Surratt. It is now 1 p.m. on April 13th, 2018, and I'm going to convene our Child Support Commission Guidelines Committee, and we will start with taking roll call. Kathleen Baker.
Present.
Karen Cliff.
Present.
Ellen Crecilius.
She's here.
That's what I thought. That's why I waited. Senator Farley. Assemblyman Fumo. Judge Hoskin.
Here.
Nova Murray.
Present.
Assemblyman Pickard.
Here.
Judge Robb. Senator Roberson. Joseph Sanford.
Here.
Judge Shirley. Justice Stiglitz. Kim Surratt, I'm present. And Don Throne.
Here.
All right, we have a quorum. Let's move on to public comment. As with our past meetings, all public comment is capped at 3 minutes per person. We will be extremely rude and cut you off, but we do it with everybody. So do we have anybody in Carson City that would like to give public comment at this time?
Nobody's
Seeing
present.
none. Okay, thank you. Anybody in Las Vegas that would like to give public comment? Seeing none. Anybody on the phone that would like to give public comment?
Yes.
All right, hearing none. We will move on and close that agenda item and move on to the next.
Kim,
Which is
someone is on the phone.
who's on the phone?
I had a public comment on the phone.
Okay. Go ahead. You have 3 minutes, and then you will be cut off. Okay. Please start with your name.
My name is Jimmy Carr. I've spoken before. I'd like to bring to the committee's attention my written suggested change to the proposed child support formula relevant to agenda items 5 and 6 today. I submitted this earlier in the week. This suggested change is derived from Exhibits 29 through 32 of James Lenoir's reports. These exhibits also chart the resulting calculations of this formula and compare those results to projected child-related expenditures. It's important to note that this suggested change does not label any parent as high income or otherwise. One benefit of this is that there are no drastic increases or decreases in support at certain income levels. Other benefits of not labeling are that the simplification will assist unrepresented parents in calculating supports, and more importantly, it's one less thing for parents to argue about. If you keep the high income designation, the direction that you're going right now, parents will undoubtedly be arguing about that designation prior to even being able to calculate anything. With a single formula applicable to all but low-income payers, things are simplified, and there's one less point of potential disagreement. With that in mind, I urge the committee to adopt a single formula like the one I've presented and strike any reference to or calculations for high-income payers from the guidelines it adopts. Finally, also relevant to items 5 and 6 today, I'd ask the committee to reinsert the word household into the deviation factor for the relevant incomes of each parent. It's important to add the word household because it gives the courts the discretion to prevent parents from avoiding support obligations by keeping their reported income low while receiving significant financial assistance from adult cohabitants. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Carr. Does anybody on the committee have questions for him? Seeing none, we will close that agenda item and move on to the next one, which is approval of the meeting minutes from March 23rd, 2018. I will abstain from that as I was not here. But do we have a motion to approve them?
I'll move to approve.
And a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Opposed? Motion carries. All right. We will move on to agenda item number 4. And Judge Hoskin, you are on the hot seat.
Okay. All right. While I admittedly neglected this for the last few weeks, been a little busy, I was able to make the changes that were requested at our last meeting, moving what used to be 12A or 12B and C into its own section under 13, included language there. You should have received a clean copy and a red line copy comparing from the last meeting to this meeting. The thought was that moving would make it simpler in making the calculations in 12 and separating out the cost of childcare and health care from the gross monthly income before the calculation starts. So that's what I did, and the results you should have copies of.
All right, admittedly, I was not at the last commission hearing, but I did listen to all the testimony. And I do note that we still have the 1/2 of with question marks. Is the concept that we'll see how the math starts working out to see if it's more economically fair to do 1/2 versus the whole, especially because of where we've moved this into the formula?
Yeah, and my recollection was that although we did talk about moving, we didn't resolve that issue, which is why I left it in brackets and italicized, so that we can play with it later if we need to once the formulas are determined.
Assemblyman Pickard.
Well, and if I can jump in, and just along those lines, although I'm assuming at some point we'll move to approve this language, there's still several areas within the gross income definition which are not finalized. They're italicized and in brackets because we haven't finalized what those sections are or other adjustments to deal with. So just so we're clear that if it's italicized and in brackets, we're still looking for further information.
This is Keith Pickard for the record. I'm wondering, it occurred to me as I was reviewing this again before the meeting, when I saw reasonable cost under 13, reasonable costs of, I was wondering if it would be overly broad if we were to say reasonable costs or apportionment thereof, because we were talking last time about we need to look for ways of giving the court discretion in these matters, because sometimes half is appropriate, sometimes it's not. And it just occurred to me that what if we were to say something like, and this, I'm just thinking out loud, what if we were to say reasonable costs or apportionment thereof, or a portion thereof of the child care? That way the court has the ability to weigh in, or would that be too broad?
Well, I don't know that I would say that it was too broad. My concern would be, from a judicial standpoint, I would be all in for that suggestion. But as a practitioner or somebody trying to do it on their own, you may think that you need the court to make that determination before you calculate it yourself. So my thought is the fact that we've got reasonable in there would lead an individual to think, okay, what is or isn't reasonable. It also gives the court the ability to make that determination at that point. So I guess my answer to your question is yes and no, depending on how you're looking at it. But overall, we are looking at this point. I didn't mention, but we did talk about it at the last meeting, including obligor or obligee in here, and I think that my final notes indicated that we weren't going to put that in there, I think, for that specific purpose. So I think we're covered the way that it's written now, at least from the discussions that I've heard so far.
Kim Surratt, yeah, I think my first instinct when you were talking was, oh yeah, give the court the discretion. But I agree. I think for the general public, that's not a fair, it would not be fair at the end of the day, right? Because they would read this and not know what to do with it. It just leaves a big black hole of what to do. Although, keeping in mind, we still have later in our proposed language, we've left that discretion for deviations with the court, and, you know, with some intent that that's, you know, if it's not coming out right on the reasonable cost of insurance, that's a location where they can deviate based on that. Any other comments on the proposed language specific to gross income? Crickets. Go ahead.
Madam
Assemblyman
Chair,
Pickard.
I like it. Of course, I was involved in its drafting, so I've had my hands on this for a while. But I think it is sufficiently detailed and clear so that it will remove the ambiguity that's currently part of our law, because we don't actually define it in law. And this is needed. So I recognize the italicized portions. These are just references to the sections. It's not substantive language. I don't see any, and Judge, maybe you can point if I'm missing it, but I don't see any substantive issues except for under 13, the half of. And I think we could strike that and still accomplish what we're trying to do. So I think it's probably premature for a notion to adopt a language, but I think that I would like to decide that this is what we're going to use and then move on to the next thing. So to the extent that that's a motion, I'll make it.
A motion to the extent that we'll adopt this language with the caveat that revisiting whether it's 1/2 of the reasonable cost of childcare and health care versus the full amount will be based on our math calculations and our assessment of whether or not we're reaching the correct numbers. Correct?
That's fairly stated, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we have a second on that motion?
Kathleen Baker, I'll second.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. We have a first and a second. Any additional discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Motion passes.
Oh, we got something done. We can go home.
Woo. Okay, I'm going to put approved, but I'm going to not forget about it for future agenda items for the purposes of that 1/2 that we'll have to come back. Okay, let's move on to agenda number 5. Good to see you back, Mr. Sanford. Before you had your leave from us, you had a very highly looked upon suggestion on how to deal with high income calculations. And we've just put on the agenda that we're going to discuss that suggestion, but I'm hoping you can create that for us or work on that for us. If you remember what I'm referencing or not, I'm not sure.
I do remember what you're referencing. I apologize. I didn't realize I was supposed to prepare something for this meeting, but
You weren't. I have it on the agenda so we'd remember to ask you to formulate something for us.
And I guess as to that discussion, I would note that the public comment from Mr. Carr and the suggestion that he provided in his public comments is sort of in the direction of what I discussed when I was here and we were talking about the high income earners and methods of doing sort of a graduated system. But so if we want to discuss based off that, or if you'd like to wait for my comments, I'd be happy to do that as well.
I would agree that Mr. Carr's language proposal is a very good start in that direction. And if you have specific comments or thoughts, or anybody else does, to assist Mr. Sanford in taking this and furthering it into what it is we're looking for, I think now's the time from the committee.
And just to start with, I reviewed it. I like a lot of the comments. I know that's it's based off Jane Venor's report. I would say the only concerns that jumps directly out to me, and the committee can have some input on this as well, is having a different income split based on how many children there are. I think, not that it's too complicated to do, but it, I think, adds different questions as to, when you become a high earner, and I think it will reflect closer to our current caps, which are done by per child, and will be closer to the numbers created by this system. Whereas if say, and for one child, it's currently, as proposed, would be 0 to 4,000. For 2 children, it's 0 to 7,000 at the highest amount, and then for 3 children, 0 to 9,000. For simplicity's sake, it would be nice if those were one number, but I would like to run the numbers and see whether that, how that would turn out if we could come to an equitable type number that would make sense for all of those situations.
Additional comments from the committee?
Kathleen Baker for the record. I don't see this really addressing the issue of the self-support, and I think that that's something that we need to maintain and look at for those individuals who are, I think we talked about 0 to 1,500 poverty guidelines. So I would still like to see that self-support provision in there somewhere.
I agree. To the extent I'm happy with some of this language, it has to do with the high income part of it. I was very happy with the work we did initially on the committee with the low income part of it, with the chart, with the self-reserve numbers, and going off of percentages of the economic data that we had. I look at this more towards the end of the high income part of it that we were looking at, that we still didn't have the right numbers for. We hadn't come to the right calculations on yet. Additional comments?
I don't dislike it. Of course, I'm presuming that we're all looking at it as the 1825-29 is simply a placeholder until we can get some further information and get to that point. I think that some of the other things we do may skew what it is we're trying to accomplish as well. But as a conceptual matter, I'm not opposed to it at all. I think it kind of deals with it and simplifies it beyond where we were looking at it before, which is the part that I like about it.
Additional comments from the committee? All right, then I would say my proposal right now is, Mr. Sanford, you have something to work off of to accomplish the high income part of it, keeping in mind that the proposed document that we have on the low income, I think we're all happy with that. That's what I'm hearing, at least as guidance from the committee. If you need additional guidance, I do believe that, and I am sure that Mr. Carr is still on the phone with us and may be available for public comment at the end of the hearing. And he seems to be well-versed at assisting us with this, so I appreciate that. Mr. Carr, if you're listening, I want you to know that we appreciate assistance from our community on this. I'm going to close that agenda item with the concept that Mr. Sanford, maybe by the next hearing, we will have something to work off of directly.
Yes, I can provide that by our next meeting.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, and on agenda item number 6, I have held off on that because of these major changes. There's not much point in doing calculations until we figured out what we were doing with the child support or with the child care and health care costs and the high income part of it, because you couldn't really do a chart. So I haven't done it pending those decisions. Based on us getting closer with this, we'll be able to actually have this on the agenda in a true go through it scenario of what we've actually drafted from beginning to end, and look at real calculations on different income levels and see where we're landing with that. Agenda item number 7. That item from the last meeting, there was discussion whether or not we had decided we wanted to do anything with that. It's not that we had decided to do anything with it. I had placed it on the agenda because it was a specific proposal from public comment that I thought wouldn't hurt to actually brainstorm on it a little bit and see if it was anything we wanted to deal with. Didn't have a specific proposal on it. I just didn't want the idea to disappear and for us to forget about it in case it assisted us along the way at any point with the work that we were doing. With that, if anybody has anything additional they want to add, I don't know that it needs any specific work right now, but if anybody has any comments to make on it, happy to take them.
Hi, Keith Picker to the record. I've been, for whatever reason, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and I really like the idea It's probably just because some of my cases are such that we've hit some of those developmental milestones. And in one case, one child was about to graduate from high school. The other was getting out of daycare and getting into regular school. And so these were significant things that ultimately, because they didn't have a per child order, it was going to be coming up anyway. And I thought, well, if the student weren't graduating from high school, they probably wouldn't be able to address it directly, except for the graduation, if you will, the matriculation into kindergarten. And so daycare costs were necessarily going to go down, but I don't think that that's a genuine reason for a review, because it's not a change in income. And so I think that we really do need to come up with a short list, and I wouldn't necessarily suggest we do a lot of these, but identify, like matriculation from daycare to regular schooling, that these should be milestones that allow parents to come in for adjustment to adjust the things that are attached to them.
At one of our really early meetings, when we had the testimony from the different states, there was that discussion about and I had put on the agenda at one point to talk about whether or not reviews, we needed them more often than every 3 years. And of course, as a committee, we decided no, but I think this topic, this title about milestones is probably the only reason why it really intrigued me about having more frequent reviews, because at the early stages, children just change so fast, and major things happen. At the teenage years, junior high, teenage years, not necessarily, right? But at those early years, they are changing that fast. I know there was a little discussion about whether or not this was within our purview, and I know when we had the discussion about the every 3 years versus substantial change being the only two grounds right now, we did decide it was within our purview by looking at what was deleted by the legislature and what we were replacing. And it may be as simple as just broadening it a little bit more. And of course, all that does really is give the court the discretion to say, yeah, okay, this is a decent time for a review versus our really narrow grounds right now of the every 3 years and the substantial change. Judge Hoskin?
Yeah, and I didn't review legislative history on this side of it, but it's always been my understanding that the reasoning behind the limitation was so that parties couldn't get a child support order and then run back in and try and get a new child support order. It was probably to benefit the court scheduling at that point in time. But I agree. I think it's too much of a one size supposed to fit all for the 20% and the 3 years. So I'm not opposed to redefining that. I don't know that I would jump on Assemblyman Pickard's bandwagon, because I think that at least and it's not the first time, at least that and I agree, coming off of daycare is a time to take a look at it. But I think it would occur naturally because now gross income has changed because there's no longer daycare costs. So I think that's built in. But I do think that there would be some other milestones that certainly, if we put our heads to it, we could come up with that would make it a little less one size fits all, for want of a better term.
Keith Pickard for the record. And I guess the reason that it came up in this case, unfortunately not before you, they had an original, or they were coming up on, the original order was going to predate the matriculation. And so we're talking about, 2 months, I guess, away, or 3, what is it? 4.5 months away from starting school when that actually changes. And so they're going to go 2.5 years without an adjustment, and yet this is real to them. It is a significant change in the economics of the situation. And remember, it's not, you don't change it every 3 years. You review it every 3 years, and you only change it if there's a 20% change. And if you've got two parents that are in a salaried position, there may be no financial change in that respect, but the underlying issues of the child can, certainly.
And I would agree. I would anticipate that even if we didn't touch the 20% as being a basis for review, the dropping off of the child care costs would probably meet that 20% threshold. So that was my only point with regard to child care.
Well, of course, now it does because of us putting it in the definition of gross income, which is
Prospective.
well, it changes the whole conversation on this. If it was under our old statutes, I'd be more inclined to say we still have a problem.
Right.
Under our new methodology with incorporating it into the gross income, it does give you a change in income.
Mm-hmm.
It does assist without it being an actual, you got a 20% change at your job. So
And admittedly, I was not
exciting.
considering that aspect, adopting this new language. But I still think that milestones are appropriate reasons to review. I think we should be fairly conservative in how many milestones we identify. And I don't mind identifying specific milestones and leaving others out, because that's a policy decision we get to make. But I do think it's appropriate to put them in, and I would encourage the body to do that.
So is that are you volunteering to try and propose some milestones, or are you volunteering somebody else?
I'll volunteer you. I seem to send everything to you, and you modify it anyway. So no, I can take a swing at that.
All right.
my suggestion is track down who gave the public comment on that to get some assistance. Patricia had mentioned it, but somebody specifically testified here.
One of the first meetings or the first?
No, it was March 9th. I have that in the agenda. It was at the March 9th meeting. So we can look at the minutes from March 9th.
And I was just going to add that now that we're sort of taking another look at deviation factors, because we would use deviation factors, the removal or addition of a deviation factor as a substantial change. For example, if daycare was a deviation factor, which now I know it may not be, the change of daycare would be addressed if the deviation factor was no longer at issue. Same respect would be if we gave a deviation for the birth of a child, that child later emancipated, mom or dad would request a modification and we could grant that. So as we're starting to remove deviations or adjustments, I think the need to address these milestones are probably that much more critical. So thank you.
Do we have additional comments from the committee? Other than instructions that Assemblyman Pickard is going to work on this language? Thank you for volunteering on that.
No problem.
All right.
Thanks, Judge.
All right, I'm going to retire that agenda item and move on to the next. Actually, I'm going to move us to agenda item number 9 next. Skip 8 for right now. And put Assemblyman Pickard back on the hot seat. And admittedly, I didn't assist on anything between the last meeting and now. After not being at the last meeting, I feel like I have a gap with what I've done, but.
All right. Well, we, again, this was something that Judge Hoskin and I were working on together. At the end of the day, we didn't get anything printed out and distributed. But ultimately, what I'm proposing is to create essentially a per child distribution of the support amount. And when I say distribution, it's with the assumption that the calculation has been decided upon. So just for sake of example today, for the sake of the discussion, say we were to take Mr. Carr's calculation, we would know what the calculations are for 1, 2, 3, or more children. And then we would take that, and I will distribute this more generally, but I'll read it right now. So item number 1, assuming that we've mapped out the calculation, whether low income, high, or whatever we call it, we then would determine the first parent's assumed support obligation by determining the number, or the first parent's GMI, then determining the number of children, calculating the support, and dividing that support by the number of children. The next step would be we'd look at the second parent's obligation, same process, determine their GMI, look at how many parents or how many children they've got, and then figure their calculation and divide by the number of children. And then all we do is we look at whether or not, we look at the custodial situation and we apply that to each of those obligations. So if we're talking about a parent has 2 children with this one parent with the other, with the co-parent, then we just combine the 2 child obligations or per child obligation to them. If it's a joint physical custodial arrangement, then we do the offset. If it's primary, we don't do the offset. But it is a streamlined, consistent calculation or formula that applies to every single custodial arrangement that we could come up with. And I'll let Judge Hoskin expand on this thought. The idea being, it's somewhat dishonest in that we go in saying that we've got a certain calculation that we're going to use for child support, and then we deviate from that immediately when we're calculating. And I guess I don't see it that way, because if we, yes, I'm setting up the counter argument and then trying to knock it down immediately. Yeah, it's not the first time and won't be the last. But ultimately, we're tasked with coming up with a calculation that makes sense with this in mind. And so it's not, they're not divorced or independent of each other. The original calculation should come up with the idea. And then we have to accept some imperfection, and I know this is probably heresy, but we have to accept some imperfection unless we want to come up with a very detailed mathematical formula that pro se litigants would never be able to figure out. Or we create a task for DWSS to come up with an online calculator that's available to everybody. Of course, what happens when that goes down? I mean, there are all sorts of problems, but I think that this is a consistent, easy to calculate, and ultimately as fair, reasonably fair as it needs to be able to address all of the different permutations of the custodial arrangements. And everybody understands it going in. And then after 3 years or however long we decide to allow cases to go before we review them, all of the inconsistencies that are built in from old orders versus new orders will resolve themselves. So I would think that within 3 years we would end up with a consistent per child calculation that everybody knows how to calculate, and it streamlines the process in litigation. So that's kind of an overview of where we are.
Before you go, can I, real quick, the obvious, I don't know if it's obvious, but one of my most, that works great when you have one judge dealing with one family or all the kids that we're talking about that's in that formula. Of course, then we get many scenarios where somebody's first kid was under California law, and that order is not going to change because that kid's still under California jurisdiction. So that kid will still have first in line, first priority, the highest, because it's California, highest child support calculation, and what money's left over really is still an issue. But I mean, that's going to be an ongoing issue anyways in our work, but.
And in those situations, Keith Pickard for the record, in those situations, there we should allow for the court to deviate and to account for things that are beyond our control and make equitable adjustments. But that's also, if we're talking about a pre-existing order, then these are addressing some of the after acquired children arguments, right? That the first child shouldn't be losing out. Their support amount should not be reduced simply because one of the parents had additional children. That's a concern that Mr. Willick brought up. I don't know that we ever satisfy that one because the flip side of that same argument is, well, why should child number 2, why should we punish the children, the after acquired children, for the, dare we say, mistakes of the parent. And many would argue it was not a mistake. This is part of our DNA. Most of us wanted children. And the first relationship didn't work out, so we moved on. So I personally think that we leave the after acquired children question for the deviation issues, that if a party comes in and makes some cogent argument as to why the court should deviate because of that sort of thing, then we allow the court to do justice. But for purposes of calculating, we come up with a straightforward, consistent way of doing things across all cases, so that, number one, pro se litigants can figure it out, and number two, we reduce the contention in the courtroom between skilled and not so skilled attorneys, and we make it clean, and then make the argument for the deviation, because I think the vast majority of times where these things are coming up, they're going to be the one-offs. They're not going to be the run-of-the-mill types of calculations that we can do successfully with this formula.
Let me start by indicating that I don't wholeheartedly disagree with what you're trying to accomplish. My problem is not on the back end, and that's kind of where you focus, is on the back end. My problem is that there has to be a front end to get to the back end. And the front end, the way that we are looking at it and have been discussing in this committee from the beginning, doesn't, and I'll use it again, is not intellectually honest with the back end. I can't, we should not propose inconsistencies in what it is that we're trying to do. And just as an example, as it stands now, we go from 18 to 25%, one child to two children, that's a 7% difference. And it's built that way because there are shared costs between having one child and having two children. And then if you use that calculation with what you've done on the back end, in one sentence I'm telling you that the difference between one child and two children is 7%, and then in the next sentence it's now 50%, which is where I get into my intellectual dishonesty. Now, that being said, I have thought about what it is that you're proposing and trying, because I like the simplicity and I like the logic in it. I haven't run it through all scenarios, and I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around not designating a primary custodian in order to calculate child support, probably because I've got a quarter century ingrained in me that that's how it's supposed to be done, but not to say that we can't teach old dogs new tricks. But I think that if we're going to go down this path, that we need to change what we're doing on the front end and perhaps come up with a per child calculation rather than a percentage calculation that isn't consistent from child to child when we're expanding out the kids.
This is Kim Surratt. When I think about what we've done from the beginning, it's not just the percentages. There was a comment in the last hearing that what we're really doing is saying what dollars are available to raise any children that are out there. Because it's about right-sized orders, right? It's not just about what it costs to raise a child, because if it was, every single one of these child support orders would be a lot larger. It's about what dollars are available to raise children. And it's not that, I like when I get into that intellectual honesty part of it, it's a lot easier to say, well, then the children should share what that pot is. We got to it a certain percentage-wise, and yeah, it went up by 7% to go from two children or one child to two children, but there's just this pot of money, no matter how you got there percentage-wise. And that pot of money, the reality is we're looking at people that do not have sufficient money for the number of children that they had to raise them. They just don't. So at what point do we go with the honesty part, which is this committee's job is to look out for the best interests of the children, and it's not our job to prioritize one child over another child and say one's more important than the other, or one's only worth 7%. Because I don't look at it, I looked at it as the math raised it by 7%, but really it's still about how much money do you make, how much is available for child support, and how do we spread those dollars out amongst the kids that we have and make that fair. The spreading out part is where it sounds like intellectually we're doing some weird math, but it's really the fair part because we're spreading out what is available.
And that's the part that I agree with, that I'm not having a problem with. It's on the front end. And if you run the numbers and say we keep the formula that we're at this point in time, you go from 3 kids to 4 kids, somebody may do that just because it's going to benefit them on their child support. Because it's not a 2% change, now it's a 25% change in what they would or would receive or would have to pay. So I think that if we can find a way to be consistent between the front end and the back end, and although Assemblyman Picker and I have been discussing things for some time, I haven't been able to wrap my head around how to make that work because I still believe that there's shared costs in raising kids. But we may have to, in order to get to that right size order, put that aside and say, this is the percentage of the income for each of your children, no matter how many children you have. We take that times whatever this percentage is, and that's how we do it, and so that we're consistent from one side to the other, and people aren't manipulating, it's not a system, but manipulating the system to get a beneficial child support order. And it sounds terrible for me to say that, but I've seen it too many times to know it's not the case in a lot of situations. So, again, I don't disagree with the way that you're proposing it. I haven't totally bought into it. But I think if we're going to go this way, we need to relook at how we're approaching the front end. And since we haven't really hammered down the cost and what we're trying to accomplish yet, and one day I know that we will, Madam Chair, but since we haven't, then I think we're still open to suggestions on how to get there. And that's what I'm saying.
Keith Pickard for the record. I completely agree. And I acknowledged at the beginning that I have the benefit of not worrying about the front end for this piece. That was not part of my assignment. And so I think what I'm going to suggest is let's attack the front end then. If at least of the 3 people that have spoken, so we probably ought to get more people involved in the conversation. But if we can agree that the target is a per-child order, that we can adjust in this fashion in a way that is clear, understandable, fair, relatively fair anyway, then we table that. We set that as a target. We don't try to finalize this language because we should, it's cart before the horse. We should do the front-end calculation and then see if this fits. But I agree completely. I think you're right. I think we do need to figure out and tackle that front-end calculation first.
Reno's here also in Vegas, so anybody in Reno like to make any comments? Yes, and Senator Roberson is here too, for the record.
Very happy to be here.
Any additional comments on this issue?
I guess I'll provide a comment for Reno or Carson. I guess what I'd say is I understand where Assemblyman Pickard is coming from as far as creating, especially in the 4D cases, we have a number of cases where a child in the first family and then a child in another family and a child in another family, and as it currently stands, you have 3 sets of 18%, and some deviation that different judges do differently, but a lot of times that parent will have substantially different orders in each of their cases, even when reviewed around the same time. And so I do like the ability for every judge in all throughout the state, as long as they are heard around the same time, to have each of these children provided for around the same amount. And I know that there was some thought, at least historically, that, it's sort of on the parent, and I'll just use the father as an exemplar, but to say, well, they decided to have another child, and so that shouldn't affect the first child's order. But I tend to agree with Ms. Surratt that, it's about how many dollars they have, and if they have more dollars available, then that's great. But that hasn't generally been my experience, in that it's hard to get those dollars, and those dollars are needed in each of those families. But I do have a concern about how we're going to try to create a per child order that makes sense for the standard, the typical family that we'd be looking at with, 2-3 kids in one home. I mean, a per child order is really helpful for some things, like, it allows it, per our new emancipation language, to not need a review because it'll be a per child order. And I think there are some advantages, but I'm having a hard time right now coming up with a good way to do that. And I'm a little concerned that I'm not sure we're going to have enough time, at least in this session of this committee, before we need to have guidelines provided to really come up with a whole new formula and really work out how that would work when we've sort of already started with the 1825. Even if they're placeholders and we might shift the numbers a little bit, a whole rework, I think, is a pretty substantial undertaking that I'm not sure that we're going to have time for.
I don't know if it's time. Personally, I don't know that it's time. I think we've gone the gamut with this committee about the repercussions between the 4D cases versus private, the software system with the state, the stomach to really truly gut and replace with a true and new system. I mean, I can tell you, I feel better every time we talk a little bit about something like that. We have much more simple, much more straightforward. This amount per child. I mean, it seems to make a lot more sense to me. But then, you start migrating. It's whether or not we're migrating towards an income model or not, and what are we doing? This was, we all agreed at the beginning of this committee, and we kind of took a little detour, and we got back to saying, all right, no, the concept was we wanted to stay somewhat with the system that we have in place and try to work with it to at least get closer to reasonable and closer to the numbers it needs to be at to at least get us caught up some, right? This committee will continue to live on. I mean, we do have this first major deadline, but we're not dead in the water after that. We continue to exist, and we can continue to tweak, and we can continue to change what needs to be changed. But I'm kind of with Assemblyman Pickard, where I have this feeling of, well, unless we've got some other proposals on the table and somebody can figure out a different methodology behind it and come up with something, because I sure as heck don't have something to stick out there as a replacement concept for it. We could sit there and complain about it, but I don't know what else there is right now. I don't have something in front of us.
Keith Pickard for the record. I completely agree with you, and I think from a practical standpoint, I think we need to make some decisions about what are we going to do in the short term and long term. I think part of that is going to be waiting to see what comes out of the reauthorized Child Custody Review Committee by the Supreme Court. That's going to be reauthorized and continued. They are looking at a label-free custodial set of custodial rules. And so assuming that those are proposed and those come up in the 19 legislative session, we're going to be forced to revisit this in a wholesale fashion. So it's my suggestion at this point, because we really only have 2 more months to complete our work before the statutory deadline, then I think that what we should probably do is make some decisions, and I would propose we stick with the 18, 25, 29 for now, and allow for the intellectual dishonesty for the next year or so, and get a program that we can put in place. And then as we see that roll out and we see what adjustments are required both by the language itself that we've adopted and the results of the Supreme Court committee, that we then make the adjustments in the next cycle of our committee. I know that's imperfect, but you know, in my experience in the legislature, most of what we do is imperfect because it's a matter of compromises, some of which don't make a lot of sense in practice. Now, I'm obviously not encouraging that, but I think it's better than what we have. It's fairer than what we have, and it's a step in the right direction with the understanding that we're going to come around and make adjustments in the future. At least we can get something done.
Nova Murray for the record.
Oh.
Sorry. Things sound so much better in my head, and when I say them out loud, they don't always come out great. One of the things we talked about was reducing your gross monthly income. What if your first child was 18% of your gross monthly income and your second child was your gross monthly income minus your child support to create your second child, and then so on and so forth? I know it sounded better in my head, but there it goes.
Judge Hoskin again. What I don't want to do, and I understand the leanings. What I don't want to do is to just come up with something because. And I've been fighting making this suggestion because I know what it's going to mean to my schedule. But I'd like to at least try to propose something that fits in with that scenario. And it's possible that I won't be successful in coming up with something that even I can agree with. But when I think about the potential from an ease standpoint of a per-child order across the board, it helps not only in the back end that Assemblyman Pickard's talking about, but in a lot of other situations where we're dealing with it with the emancipation side, with a lot of other different aspects. And I'd hate to just not try. I think we have, and I agree with Mr. Sanford, we're pressed on time, but I think we have enough time to at least give it a shot. So I'm volunteering to try.
That's the words I like to hear. All right.
Can I just add?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
please.
Karen Cliff, DA's office. Without sort of being part of those discussions offline regarding how we're sort of getting to this calculation and sort of the impact of the Miller case, at the last session we discussed there was some discussion about Miller and its applicability in all of these various sort of custodial situations. I have two concerns from the 4D program without really sort of seeing what this formula is going to look like. If whatever formula we sort of come up with is reliant in any way on knowing the custodial parents' total number of children and or income, it would cause a great hardship to our program, and it would cause a lot of inaccuracy. And I say this because there is a large number of cases in our state, just like I've said multiple times, just in Clark County alone, we're looking at between 53 to 54,000 cases. Those cases are not always opened up by a petitioner. They are opened up by welfare. And we don't know how many children petitioner has. What we do know is how many children petitioner has with this exact non-custodial parent. But if we have non-custodial parents that are paying the petitioner, whether directly through an out-of-state order, through another jurisdiction, so we don't ever really know how many children are involved in the case on a large number of our caseload. We also don't know what petitioner's income is. Again, because these are, it's through the state, so in those instances we know that that individual is receiving state aid. but we don't have enough sufficient contact to know what petitioner's income is. So any sort of formula that's going to be proposed, again, if it's reliant on the total number of children for accuracy or income, that's where the 4D program will have some concerns.
Keith Pickard for the record. Let me just ask a couple of questions on that, if I may. Do you think that, well, first, how does the 4D program currently handle those cases? Do you just assume that the total number that we're dealing with are the total number in existence? How do you currently deal with it? And then secondly, is it fair to say that the obligor has a duty to participate in the process, and if they decline, then they're stuck maybe with a higher order than would otherwise obtain had they been involved, and is that not unfair?
So right now, because we're an obligor-based income system, both in and out of the 4D program, right now our formulas are based entirely, until we get into a Wright v. Osborne or some sort of split custody situation, all of our cases now are based upon respondent's income only. So it's been easy to facilitate that since it's been the formula within our state. So we easily take a respondent's gross monthly income, we assess the 18%. If the respondent has additional children they're responsible for, they are either given a deviation or not at the discretion of the hearing master. And so generally they are compliant, and we are fortunate enough to have access to other cases within our office. So while they may not always bring it to our attention affirmatively, we're aware of it because of their other cases, and we're always forthcoming with the court.
Okay, and that's addressing those that are engaged and give
Yes.
the program the information. Those I'm not concerned about, because then they'll tell you how many kids they have, and we fit that right in. I'm concerned about those that don't participate. Let me just cut to the chase. My feeling is, and this is just my initial response, is that if a parent is subject to an order from your office,
Yes.
and they don't participate, and so they're given 18% for this one child, when maybe it should have been 12.5% because they have two kids, but they didn't participate, well, shame on them.
No, our agency, if they're not involved, they have not requested a hearing. By statute, we're permitted to default, but we do consider their other children because they're in our system and we're aware of it.
Right, and I'm just saying that to the extent that the program, your office, does not have information,
Yes.
that's not your fault. So you just go with what you know. So if you know he has or she has one child or two, you plug that information into the calculation, you move forward, it's dealt with.
As would be faced with private practitioners who have a petitioner, custodial parent that walks into the office and says, hey, I'm seeking child support on this individual. They may not know that this individual is subject to 3 other child support orders. This is an issue that's not just isolated with the 4D program. It's isolated in the fact that these parties oftentimes don't know the depth of the other person's life.
And I completely agree with that. I mean, I do experience that. But then it still behooves the respondent in that situation to step up and inform the court as to, we're talking outside the program.
Yes.
To inform, and if they don't, then they're waiving their right, at least temporarily, to do so.
They are. My concern is not so much with the non-custodial parents. I feel like we have enough safeguards in place in terms of information. My concern is anytime we have to create a child support figure and we need both parties' information. That's where the 4D program is going to run into some concerns. We have a non-active party. We represent the state. So our income is based solely upon a respondent. So again, anytime we have to then look at a petitioner's income, that's where we're going to run into some issues. And if you're looking at the total number of children on both sides, that's the issue, right? Because now there's this disparity. We know how many children respondent has. We don't know how many petitioner has because those cases are referred to us by the state. That petitioner may have 5 other children, but she's not getting there's no benefit to that, I guess. There's just not enough information to sort of fulfill what the intent of Miller is. Because Miller was joint, there were parents engaged on this one case, but when you apply Miller to every custodial situation, suddenly you get the benefits of all these other children, but without the information to really satisfy Miller's intent. That's, I think, the issue. But I'm happy to look at any formula. I just wanted to communicate that the 4D program does have we're limited in our information because we don't have two active parties.
So Ms. Cliff has volunteered to help me with my task. Is that what I heard?
Absolutely.
All right, great.
Music to my ears. I'm going to go ahead and close agenda item number 9 based on that volunteerism, and I want to do agenda item number 11 next. As there was discussion, and I wasn't here for it last time, the definitions that I provided was pure and simple. At one of our hearings, looking at Wisconsin statutes, we saw those definitions in there. I pulled the language as a placeholder. I did not edit that language. I did not touch it because we had not had an ounce of discussion about split versus serial versus shared parenting. My concern was just it wouldn't hurt to have some definitions when we finally developed this language, but it has not been edited since. Other than I took out obvious things that mentioned Wisconsin statutes or, that kind of stuff. So it was cleaned up a teeny bit for that purpose. However, my suggestion right now would be that I work on that based on the discussions we've been having, and I now make some modifications to it with the knowledge of a little bit of where we're going. Not that we have not that we've made any conclusions on that yet, but I don't think the definitions hurt. Also, when I pulled that language, we didn't have Miller, and there's some resources now for me to kind of take a look at and play with that language. Any other comments about agenda item number 11?
Keith Pickard for the record. I would just mention that if we were to adopt the mechanism that I'm proposing, the labels are irrelevant. Because it becomes a per child order. We've considered the different permutations of the different custodial arrangements. It might be helpful for discussing them to label them, so I'm not suggesting we don't create the labels, but I think that with respect to the calculations themselves, that it becomes a moot point. But I do think it's probably helpful, at least so that we are all talking on the same page, to say what a split condition is versus a shared condition, and to create those definitions, but I don't see them actually going past the definitional section.
I kind of saw it just as a placeholder to not forget about all three of those scenarios, so that whatever formula we came to, we knew we had to keep all those different families in mind.
I'll work with that.
Don, did you have a comment?
Well, I was going to. Keith made my comment in part that we aren't going to need this if we come up with the per child. But the other thing a per child order would do is we could do away with deviations for other children. Another way, if you have a payor has 5 children, 3 with somebody not in the home and 2 that are in their home, you can do a per child order and share the income resources fairly.
This is Keith Pickard for the record again. I don't know that I would eliminate that as a deviation factor, because what I had in my mind was what happens when you have special needs kids where you actually need an augment for one child that the calculation doesn't address. So I wouldn't eliminate it completely, but you're right, it will functionally resolve most of those deviations that we're currently using.
Any additional comments before I close that agenda item? Okay. Go back to agenda item number 10. And Ms. Baker, do you have a desire to start that conversation?
Well, I've sent out the language, and I actually will defer to Judge Hoskin, who has looked at it and has what I consider to be a very good suggested change to it.
That was very smooth, Ms. Baker. I'm giving you full credit for that. No, she did, and I sort of, against my better judgment, agreed to help her, and if helping is me reviewing it for 5 minutes before the meeting, then I fulfilled my duty. My only suggestion on this, I like the language. Some of it may become moot depending on what we end up doing with other things we've discussed today, but my suggestion is under paragraph C. It currently reads, beginning at the end of the second line, the only way to adjust the ongoing child support order is to file a motion with the court, and then goes on from there. My hesitation, and I discussed this with Ms. Baker, is that it bothers me, and I've had this conversation with Mr. Pickard as well, when we speak in such definite terms as only or always or never. So my suggested change is fairly minor. After the comma in the second sentence, I'm proposing that it says, in order to adjust the existing ongoing child support order, a motion must be filed with the court. That way we're not covering something that we may be covering unintended consequences, I guess.
So, and when we talk in absolutes, what that just triggered in my brain was, what about a stipulation? Versus just, the motion language makes it sound like they can't just...
Well, I'm not opposed, and I hadn't thought about that. I was just trying to get rid of the only.
Right,
But
right.
you could certainly say a motion must be filed with the court or a stipulation entered modifying.
Are we alleging current income?
Keith Pickard for the record. I like that idea, if only because I intend to bring a bill, if I'm elected, to allow for summary disposition of just about everything we do. If parties can reach agreement on things, I think we should encourage them to do it. And so I like the idea of adding stipulation, a motion or stipulation to resolve this.
Yeah, and just as I'm thinking about it, along those lines, perhaps we put the parties may stipulate, or so that stipulation is the first option rather than a secondary option. So I'm okay with moving it to the front of that as an option prior to filing a motion. And I didn't discuss that with you, Ms. Baker. I don't know how you feel about that.
I would be in agreement with both those suggestions.
On the record,
Sorry,
please.
Judge Hoskin. Sorry. I'm having an offline conversation. If we end up with if I'm somehow able to change my thinking and come up with a per child order, it's going to make some of this moot because you wouldn't need either of those options if we know what the per child cost is.
Although it never hurts in the language to still explain to them that if they expect a change in the numbers down the road, that reinforcement of what they need to do, both in the statute, in clear guidelines, I mean, just straight up what's expected, that they're not going to get a higher or lower child support amount, but for going to the court or stipulating and applying it, but stipulating and taking that to the court. I think we need to be clear. Any additional comments on this language? Do we want to entertain a motion with the proposed edits? Do the edits and then come back for a motion on it down the road? I don't mind that. I think that's fine. Ms. Baker, are you going to make the edits to this language?
I'll be happy to do that. Do we want to include something about, in the case of a per-child order being developed by our committee, that we would still have some of the language in here about changing the amount? You'd have to go back to court.
Yes.
I will work on that.
Any other ideas for Ms. Baker while she's working up these changes? Anybody need to bring up anything else in here? I'm sure we'll reread it again later and have more edits. That's kind of how that works, but. Okay, are we done with this agenda item? Hearing no further comments, we will move on to do agenda item number 12. Discussion and recommendations regarding proposed language from Ms. Throne addressing self-determination and stipulated orders. I know last time there was quite a bit of conversation about this.
And on that item, I must apologize. I did not get the revision out to everyone to look at, but the areas we did talk about revising would be on the public assistance language mainly. So that, if we can move that item, I will have it the next time we can finalize that, hopefully, and put that to bed.
Okay. We will table agenda item number 12 for future meeting. Agenda item number 8, we have not discussed. I would propose that we also table that one because this issue of additional dependents, we haven't got past court-ordered additional dependents, much less additional dependents without a court order, to have a decent discussion on that, in my opinion.
We could have a discussion.
Well, what discussion would you like to have? Any comments?
I was just suggesting we could have a discussion. I don't know that we'd get anywhere, but we could
don't-
certainly have a discussion.
All right. With that, we have gone through our agenda. Very efficient today. Other than, let's talk about, we have future agenda items to discuss, and then, but I want to talk about the future meeting dates first. So let's do agenda item number 14. I did talk, Joy and I looked into the possibility of having space to utilize for April 20th and 27th, the next 2 Fridays, as additional potential dates that we could fill in. I told her even if we only did short meetings like today, we did discuss the possibility and the need for cramming in a couple additional meetings. I think today's a good example of how, if we just do a little shorter but more often, we could probably get this done so that we can keep revisiting our language. Question is, do we have an appetite for either of those dates or both of those dates as potential?
Just the 20th, I'm sorry, we're having another conversation. The Nevada District Judges Association Conference is next week, so I don't believe Judge Rob or I would be able to attend that one.
Okay.
This is Kathleen Baker. I will also be available on the 20th.
Okay, so the 20th is not sounding like a viable date, but I'm not hearing anything really about the 27th. So why don't we add the 27th as an additional date for an additional meeting? And as usual, let me hold on, I'm going to write that down.
Do we know if the building, this building?
I can tell you, let me switch to a different screen, and I can tell you what was available for the 27th. There were not rooms available in Vegas in this building, but Joy had informed me that she did reserve rooms with DWSS, just in case. So we will have rooms, it won't be in this building. They do have rooms available in Carson City on that date. So we will be fine in Carson City, being at the legislature on that date.
So yes on the 27th.
So yes on the 27th as an additional meeting. And then we have already scheduled after that May 4th, which is just 1 week later after that. We already had a second meeting, May 25th in May. And I don't know if we need to squeeze another one in between May 4th and May 25th, but Joy and I will work on that also and see what we can accomplish and throw some dates out for that. And my goal would be from here out to do these shorter, more efficient meetings and really get the documents out there in between so that the time and energy we're spending is on reviewing those documents and come to the meetings a little more prepared on them versus a long drawn out 4-hour meeting like we've had in the past. or 3-hour meeting. Were they 4-hour and then do a 3-hour meeting, somewhere in there. Okay, with that, let's do agenda item number 13, discuss and approve ideas for future agenda items. Other than I need to rework this agenda and get things streamlined and cleaned up, especially with the work that we're doing at this point. I know I need to do that. Are there additional items you want to see added to the agenda?
Judge Hoskin, I don't know that it's an additional item, but as we continue, and today we approve some more language, and I know Judge Robb is not here, so I hate throwing her under the bus because we've kind of made her the scribe for the new statute. We need to think about putting that in a form that's more conducive to what we would want to submit in final form. It's currently all under 125B070, and it may need to be 7.5 and 8.0, and I don't know how we're going to end up doing that because we've got so many different topics in there. I don't know if that needs to be a separate agenda item or if that's something that the chair is going to be championing, but I think before we get too far down the road, we might want to think about how we're going to end up drafting this in final form.
I suspect we can probably, Keith Pickard for the record, we can probably get LCB to help us on that because that's what they do. And since this is going to be in regulation, not in statute, chances are we can start from scratch. We can specify the nomenclature and the I don't know what to call it, numeration. We can start from the beginning and make it logical, and LCB is very good at that sort of thing.
So what I am hearing, what I think I do need to do though, is add an agenda item for the specific to the master document in terms of us checking it, making sure that motions that we have made it into that master document so that whatever we give to LCB is the correct document and actually reflects the motions that we made and the votes that we had on different things. So I will add a agenda item specific to a review of the master document each time.
And I'll reach out to Brenda Erdo's LCB council to make sure they're okay with this before I absolutely commit them to doing it. I'll do that today.
Well, and I assume because everything we do anyway, will ultimately go to Ledge Commission anyway, so it's going to have to be in the format they want at some point, the format they desire. Okay, additional agenda items? Tom?
Do we have on there then, the last time I looked at the agenda, we didn't have one going back and looking at the underlying formula. Do we need to add that so we can act on that next time with, if Judge Hoskin comes up to something good? Seems like that's not on the current agenda.
Yeah, we used to have it on the agenda as review of Judge Robb's document is kind of what I was calling it. But you're right. That probably could be covered when we start looking at the master document because that'll be, and under the item where proposed percentages for average income calculations, that is on the agenda. And so we just haven't gotten to a clean point where we can really look at some proposed calculations. I'm hoping when we get somewhere with this shared custody part of it, we can really start to pump out some numbers to look at. Okay, additional agenda items? All right. Hearing none, we will close that agenda item and move on to agenda item number 15, which is our closing public comments. Our public comments are limited to 3 minutes. I will cut you off, even if it's mid-sentence. Do we have anybody in Carson City that would like to give public comment? Seeing none, anybody physically in Las Vegas that would like to give public comment? Seeing none, anybody on the phone that would like to give public comment?
Yes, I would.
Hearing none. Oh,
Jimmy Carr again.
okay, go ahead, Mr. Carr. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, thanks. I heard some comments regarding the differences in income brackets among the different numbers of children, and I wanted to explain the reasoning behind that. Those numbers were specifically selected to simulate or come close to the state's presumptive maximums. This is according to James Denor's report. Personally, I feel more comfortable keeping the brackets the same across all the numbers of children, but I kept my language consistent with her report so that the committee can assess the calculations using her graphs, because her graphs show exactly what the results of the formula would be. And the committee could go from there and make any adjustments that they would want. Also, I heard some comments about, some discomfort as far as low-income payers with what I had suggested. I do not suggest taking out the low-income information that's currently in there, or the low-income stuff that's currently in there. It's a separate thing, and what I'm talking about here is just average and high-income payers. So that's all I had.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Carr. Again, I want to express my appreciation for the work that you have done. It takes a lot for the public to actually jump forward with actual materials and suggestions, hardcore suggestions for us, and I really want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Is there anybody? You're welcome, thank you. Is there anybody else on the phone that would like to give public comment?
Yes, I would. Michael McDonald.
Okay, Mr. McDonald, you have 3 minutes.
I like what you guys are doing here and discussing it and being thorough on changing our child support laws out here. There's so much that needs to be put in place and changed, and there's so many different circumstantial and scenarios that there isn't a one size that will fit all for all the different kind of child support calculations that can possibly exist. I'm still working on some experts across the country about what they're doing in other states and countries to change the laws. And I'd like to work with some people here, talk with Mr. Carr as well. We're going to see if we can come up with something that we can put up in front of you guys that would be best. Is me and a bunch of people across the nation are being affected by this, and it's one of the root causes of the incentive for fighting over your own children. And I believe you guys keep discussing the Title 4D statutes and what will affect that. And I understand that you guys are seeking that federal money. It's $16 billion. It's a lot of money to do for the matching programs that it does pay out. But I would suggest that we need to be working on the parental involvement, not just enforcement. I would suggest that changing the child support method instead of a percentage to a low flat rate or whatever the national average is, or taking a real look at what most parents want to take care of their children, and what it takes to pay for their children and do support of that, and taking that into consideration and not going and forcing them or putting them in jail for not paying that amount. I would suggest that the parents that want nothing to do with their children, that don't want to support their children, then they should be the ones that are paying it. But to go and enforce a percentage of somebody's income on multiple children, I don't think that's the best method. If we could do a low flat rate or something like that, to $100 to $300, whatever that is per child, and not a percentage, it would de-incentivize the fighting over the children and stop a lot of the alienation and the litigation that's going on. That's why we have so many people fighting for custody of their children, to attain primary custody so that they can get paid out. And I don't think that's not a good way to incentivize that. It's causing all these issues and psychological issues with children when you have both the parents fighting because of money and the sentence that the attorneys and the system is making off of the children that are being affected by this. So I would like that you guys be very thorough on that and consider that. And maybe, I don't know if you have jurisdiction on, or if that's the purview for the committee for changing the involvement or the enforcement of this. But looking at the numbers are making people fight over their children, and it's one of the root causes of parental alienation and pathogenic parenting. And if that issue gets addressed, it'll have a profound rippling
Okay, thank you, Mr. McDonald. It's been 3 minutes, and I appreciate your, thank you. All right, is there anybody else on the phone that would like to give public comment at this time? Hearing none, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hold your peace. All right, everybody have a good weekend.